honored guests and friends and fellow attendees, good morning. Our theme for the conference this year is Gateways to Growth. And our first plenary speaker is certainly active in helping provide one of those gateways to growth through his work in further education. In his work as Dean of Graduate and Professional Studies and Director of the Center for Teacher Education Training and Research at the School for International Training. In his work as past president of KOTESOL Incorporated, member of the board of the KOTESOL International Research Foundation, and as a member of the International Advisory Council for the University of Cambridge KOTESOL examinations. And his topic today is about using the classroom as a gateway of growth for our students. Our plenary address will be, the Saturday plenary address will be creating a framework of classroom participation. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to join with me in welcoming from the School for International Training in Battle Grove, Vermont, USA, Dr. Donald Freeman. I'm going to talk from this side of the stage. We're having, as you probably saw the light show here, a little bit of technical problems with that. So, let's see. Do you think we're going to get it to go, or shall we go without it? Okay. All right. What I want to talk about this morning is the notion of how we use participation in classrooms. And I want to start with my punchline. You know, when you tell a joke and it has a punchline, usually when I tell a joke, I get it all out of order and I end up telling the punchline before I get to the part that makes the punchline funny. So using the same sort of strategy, I thought I would tell you the punchline for my plenary before I get to the part of the plenary that tells you why the punchline actually matters. The punchline is this. What you do is shaped by who you do it with. What you do is shaped by who you do it with. So that's the basic idea of what I want to speak to you about this morning. If we take that basic idea, the punchline, what you do is shaped by who you do it with, and we express it in terms of theory, it sounds a little bit different. The theoretical version of that, are we okay now? We hope we're okay. When we move forward, can we lower these lights? You all can't see that, can you? No, okay. Lower the lights here, please.
Something. Anybody. Lower the lights.
Don't you love technology? Next one, yeah. Not getting anything.
That big?
Okay. And here come the lights. Sean's up there. He's on it. And they're down. Okay.
Yay!
I'll quibble on the head. Okay. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm over your head.
Yeah. So here's the punchline. What you do is shaped by where you do it and who you do it with. If we put that in terms of theory, if we can go on, the theoretical version of that is this. Participation is shaped by sociocultural context. Sounds a lot different, doesn't it? Taking apart the concept of sociocultural context for a minute, socio simply means people, who you do things with. And cultural means the ideas or the values or the ideologies, the histories that make those people a group. So when we think about participation as being shaped by sociocultural context, What we're saying, in essence, is what you do is shaped by where you do it and who you do it with, and how the ideas and values of those people make things possible or not possible. Well, that's the big idea. What I want to do in my time with you this morning is to focus on what this idea looks like when we put it in the context of the classroom. What does it mean to think about participation as a sociocultural framework in the context of classrooms? I'm going to do three things if my time permits. The first is to work on a couple of what I would say are big ideas about this notion of participation in classrooms. The second, then, is to turn to what I would loosely refer to as a research project that I and some colleagues at the School for International Training carried out for McGraw-Hill on looking at this notion of participation in classrooms. And what we found when we looked at how teachers actually structure participation in classrooms. And that will take me to my third point, which is the so what part of the talk. What does this mean in terms of application? So let's start then basically with the core idea of what this means to look at participation in the classroom. Let's go ahead. Basically, when we think about participation in the classroom, it's a balancing act. There are two forces that are going on. The one that I would refer to is the teacher's intention. What it is that you, as the teacher, want, intend, think, have in your mind, have planned, etc., etc. Where you're going with what's happening in the classroom. The other side of that, on the far side, are student expectations. What your students expect, what they don't expect, what they're willing to do, what they're not willing to do, what they're interested in, what they're not interested in. Balancing that yin and yang of intention on the one hand and expectation on the other is in essence how we're going to understand this issue of how participation works in classrooms. So let's go ahead. Basically, what we've got to understand is the light green space in the center. What does it mean to have a common area between what the teacher intends and what the students expect? If we think about it, the public face of the teacher's intention in the classroom is how she sets up and manages what goes on. The rules she sets, the norms she expects. For example, does she expect that the lesson will be conducted only in English, or will there be a place also for the L1? Does she expect everyone to participate, or does she just expect those who want to participate voluntarily? Does she expect that things will be corrected immediately, or corrections will evolve out of the activity? All of that is part of the management, what I would call the management of the lesson. Other side, the public face of the students' expectations are whether they're willing to play the game, how involved they're going to be or not in what's going on. And it's a pretty common experience to have a brilliant lesson and students who aren't on the same page. They just don't want to play along. Or to put another way, as a friend of mine says, it does take two to tango, especially in the classroom. So the side of the student equation isn't simply the interest in getting involved in the lesson. It's more than that. It's the norm. Is it okay to try out something if you're not particularly comfortable in English as the second language? Is it okay to make mistakes? Is it okay to advance your own opinion? Is it okay to work with colleagues or fellow students to come up with something? All those is it okays are in essence part of the sociocultural context and what students expect as they participate. And if, as a teacher, your intention runs contrary to those expectations, then there is basically no common ground to work from. Put another way, when the common ground is there, it's invisible. Because the lessons work really well. There are no problems. When the common ground is not there, or less there, then it becomes increasingly evident. It becomes evident because the lesson is not going as planned, because students are perhaps not participating as volubly and actively as we would want them to. When the common ground is missing, things fall apart. So let's look at what goes into that common ground. What is this common area between intention and expectation made up of? Before I do that, I want to ask you to just think for a minute about a lesson that didn't go quite as you had intended it to. What are some of the things that happened? When things fell apart, how did they fall apart? And I'm sure that in this wonderful audience, everybody has never had a lesson that fell apart. Yeah. Yeah, they pull back. The board are disinterested. Yeah, they all want to leave and go to the bathroom. Sorry? Cell phones ring. Yes.
Sleeping, but other people's classrooms.
They start talking about what they're going to do on Saturday night. Sorry?
Sleeping.
Or people fall asleep.
In other people's classes.
Or the equipment fails. I'm glad you brought that up. Yes. And that's on the intention side of things. Right. They're talking their L1, which is a perfectly natural thing to do. Anything else? Silence. There's silence, as I had just a minute ago. Yes. Or people look confused. It's okay. So leave it there. That's fine. So what we've been talking about essentially then are things that go wrong on the instructional side when the equipment fails. No one's mentioned anything that goes wrong on the curricular side. Bad books. Let's hear it for bad books. Right. I mean, there may be something in the book that is inappropriate, that isn't interesting, that doesn't engage, it goes on and on. Or it may be an activity that simply isn't doable, doesn't work in a classroom. Okay, can you advance one? Just one. And mainly you've been talking about what's in the middle there. The roles that students and teacher play. And primarily you're referring, because you're teachers, to the roles that students play or don't play. They don't turn off their cell phones. They seem to have weak bladders and need to go to the bathroom all the time. They're more interested in Saturday night. They are speaking in their L1. All kinds of behaviors that are ways of sort of putting a face on what they expect to happen in the lesson that isn't there. So these three elements, instruction, curriculum, and roles of teacher and students, really are what make up that gray area, the common ground between management on the one hand and participation on the other. So this, I would suggest, is a basic map of what we have when we look at this interaction between classroom management and student participation and how they come together or they don't come together. Now, I want to make an argument that the reason that things fall apart is because these three elements are often misunderstood or misconstrued. What I want to say, there are some basic, what I would say are misconnects. You understand what I mean by misconnects? Ideas that don't line up. Systems that don't talk to each other, things that don't connect, that have to do with instruction, curriculum, and roles of teacher and student, that if we think about in different ways, if we organize in different ways, we may stand a better chance of expanding that common ground and having things function more as we intend them to function and as students expect them to function. So let me introduce to you to the first of these misconnects. And I wanted, do you want to go ahead? Go ahead. Go ahead. The first one has to do with instruction. And Basically, I think what happens in instruction is that often as teachers we put more emphasis on what I would call telling or exercising our intention than we do on doing, which is engaging students' expectation, as messy and complex and often out of kilter as those expectations might be. Let me illustrate what I mean with a story. Story comes from some work that was done by Courtney Kasdan and Sarah Michaels, two classroom researchers in the mid-late 1990s. No, actually, I guess it was a little earlier than that, early 1990s. And you can tell it's a little dated in interesting ways. The context of this story was the fact that at this point, many classrooms in the United States, elementary school classrooms, two things were going on. One, process writing, which you may be familiar with. People familiar with the ideas of process writing? Yeah. The idea that essentially students learn to write by writing, so writing and revision is extremely important. You start simply by trying to express what your ideas are as a writer, and then through the revision process you get closer and closer to a final draft that represents the conventions of writing. Process writing was very widespread in American elementary schools, point one. Point two, computers were coming in a big way, and there was a lot of money to get computers into the classroom. We're talking about L1 English medium classrooms in elementary schools. So the issue was, how did you bring process writing together with the bringing in of all these computers? Well, clearly computers offer the opportunity to revise writing in a way that, when you used to have to do it simply by hand, makes it a very different process. Well, Kasdan and Michaels were interested in what happens when you introduce a computer into the classroom. How do kids learn how to use the computer? And they looked at two classrooms. One in which, in both classrooms I should say, the teachers did not consider themselves computer comfortable or literate. Again, this is over more than a decade ago. And so they were not particularly comfortable with instructing or telling the students how to use the computer, how to use the word processing programs on the computer. Classroom A, what the teacher did was she simply let the kids, as they were working in their process writing groups, spend time at the computer, entering their writing and revising it. Classroom B, the teacher did the same thing, but she made one fundamental change. She changed the groups around at every 2 weeks. What Kasdan and Michaels did is, at the very beginning of the year, they gave the kids a basic 20-item word processing test. Did they know how to copy? Could they know how to cut and paste? Could they know how to move things around, correct, and so on? They gave them the same test at the end of the year. Classroom A, remember, the groups just came up, used the computer, went back, and so on. That continued throughout the year. Classroom B, the groups did the same thing, but the groups were changed every couple weeks. Which of those two classrooms do you think became more proficient at the computer by the end of the time? B or A? Yeah, B definitely became more proficient. Why? Well, there's collaboration in both. What's the difference?
Peer support.
There's peer support in both. Different what? Different brains, right. In other words, by mixing the groups up, you ended up with different people. You had different perspectives, or in this very concrete sense, different levels of knowledge about word processing. So that in classroom A, if you were in a group with a kid who, your peer really understood how to make it work, you were golden. If you were in a group with nobody really understood how to make it work, you might get better, but you certainly were going to get better a whole lot more slowly. If you were in classroom B, your chance of ending up with a kid who knew what he or she was doing was greater. It's a very basic, non-rocket science kind of idea. But what it began to point the way to, which became much more prevalent in the late 90s, was the notion of distributed knowledge. That obviously everybody doesn't know the same things. Obviously everybody doesn't know the same things to the same degree. And so as a teacher, you can approach that in one of two ways. put it very broadly. You can ignore it and let the social patterns of the classroom fall out as they will, or you can orchestrate it, meaning that you can move participants around so that that knowledge gets redistributed. Now, in language classrooms, we're pretty used to that idea. But in classrooms with other subject matters, it's not something that teachers often attend to. So, point one, I think the misconnect around that common area there, the common ground in the area of instruction, is that teachers often exercise more management by telling than they do more engagement by doing. One group that came in from the playground ended up right near me where I was sitting. And there were 5 kids. And they were all, hunched over this table. And there was a candy bar in front of them. And they were really, really actively engaged in this discussion of how they were going to divide this candy bar. Because it was one of those candy bars that was divided in quarters. It had the little lines down it so you could snap it into 4 bits. The problem was there were 5 people. So you could tell one person to get lost and snap it into 4 bits. Or you could figure out how to redivide it. And this was what they were talking about. And they got a little bit loud, and the teacher said, okay, you have to put that away. We're going to start our lesson on fractions now. Classic moment. We've all done this, right? We've all missed the teachable moment by a mile. Now, this is interesting, and bear with me as we think about this story. There are a lot of things you could take from it. It's not a story, it's a true account. I use the term story loosely. There are a lot of things we could take from this. One is the idea that the teacher blew it. She could have realized that what was going on in the curriculum at this point was fractions. That was her intention. What was going on with this group of students was dividing up a candy bar. That's what they expected to get done. And she could have brought the two together and created a common ground around it. Could have, but didn't. And even if she had done that, I'm not sure she would have necessarily gotten everybody involved because there were 30 kids in the class. That candy bar was not going to be divided into 30 pieces. So she could have taken this and say, okay, we have a group of 5 kids dividing up a candy bar. How are they going to do that? All of a sudden, which is a very real thing, becomes a task for the whole class. And what happens to its interest level? It goes down. And it's a classic thing we do in education where we say, well, this is a very realistic setting. This is a very interesting task. Let's just amplify it so we get the whole class involved. What we miss there is why do those kids care whether they get a fifth of a candy bar? Why do they care? It's not rocket science. They want it. They want to eat it. So if you're going to take a candy bar and divide it up amongst 30 kids, it's a non-event. Nobody's going to get anything enough to eat from it to make it particularly interesting. What we miss in this kind of a situation is that it is student interest, or what I would call engagement, that drives this. It's not the task. And in language teaching, we have recently, I think, become so engaged with the notion of tasks that we have overlooked or perhaps deluded ourselves into thinking that the classroom is a fundamentally unreal place, and that there are no tasks that we can do in the classroom that really map directly onto the world outside the classroom. That fundamentally language classrooms are bizarre. There's no other way to put it. They are an environment in which language is used in ways that it is rarely used outside of the world. Tasks may help us to replicate the language as it looks like it is being used in the outside world, but they rarely can replicate the interest that drives the use of that language, the interest in dividing up the candy bar. Which is why I think the misconnect between task and topic is to not think that topic is actually very powerful. Topic is what engages people. Topic is what makes them interested. And we often think that it is simply tasks. Give students something to do, a jigsaw listening, a back-to-back math exercise, an information gap. Give them a task and that will engage them. Keep them busy, yes. Engage them, maybe. So this disconnect between task and topic at the level of curriculum really has to do with understanding what makes learners' expectations tick. What makes them drive the lesson. And that is, I think, the key piece in a curriculum that we have to understand and think about. Because fundamentally, no organized curriculum can do that. It's always going to depend on some amount of real-time engagement. Okay, going to the third point about roles, student and teacher roles. Here, a lot of the examples you gave were examples that had to do with students not playing the role that they were supposed to play in the lesson. And that's pretty common, I think, that it happens more often than not. As I said, when the common ground is invisible, everything's going well. When it becomes visible, we know that there's this disengagement between intention and expectation. Let me tell you a story to illustrate this third point. A friend of mine is a kindergarten teacher, and she was telling me this story. I ran into her in the supermarket the other day. It was, actually about a month ago, just when the school year was beginning in the United States. She had a new group of kindergartners, and they were sitting, on a circle early on, and she asked one of her students, she asked the group, rather, I guess, who knows what the word cooperate means? Big word for a bunch of 5-year-olds. And one kid puts up his hand and says, cooperate means doing what you want us to do. He'll go far. He's got a career. Put another way, he already knows the cultural part of sociocultural participation. He knows what cooperate means in classrooms. Too often, I think, the roles of teachers and learners are organized around the dominance of one over the other. And that's the zero-sum game. Basically, the zero sum of it all is that students can always win. Put another way, there's no way you can manage a lesson to make it work. It's got to flow from effective participation if it's going to work. So let's then turn, looking at these three frames, if you want to just go ahead, to, let's go through this. We just talked about this. Keep going. And one more. They're a little out of order. And next slide. I'm sorry, we got a little... Next slide. Yeah. I want to talk in closing now, for the last 10 minutes or so, about these ideas of misconnects and what we found when we began to look at these ideas in the context of classrooms. And this comes from this work of the ICON project. The ICON project is a project that was a 2-month online research project that was sponsored by McGraw-Hill and conducted through the center that I direct at SIT. And the aim of the project was, as you can see here, to describe how teachers use course books as they teach basic to low intermediate students in a range of classrooms around the world. What's that got to do with the common ground? Well, we were interested, and as was McGraw-Hill, in this notion of what happens when things don't work out. What happens when books fall apart? Where do they fall apart? Why do they fall apart? And, of course, in the development of published materials, as many of you know, many times teachers are asked to work as consultants. But they're always asked to work as consultants, or not always, but generally asked to work as consultants, looking ahead at new material. And very rarely is there an opportunity to reflect on what's actually going on currently and how it's working or not working. So in this process, in this project, what we wanted to do was to look at what happens with course books, particularly when things fall apart or when they don't in classrooms. Let's go ahead to the next slide. So let me just unpack this for a minute. When we said that we wanted to describe how teachers use course books, we're particularly interested in what I would call patterns of activity. As I said, what makes the lessons work or not work, points of breakdown, repair, how things got fixed and back on track if they had fallen apart. Course books, we ended up through a selection process of people who worked with 6 different well-known international EFL course book series. And by basic and intermediate students, we simply let the participants define what that language level meant. And we used the reference point of the course book that they referred to as a way to triangulate. So if they said, well, I'm thinking, or I'm talking about a basic or intermediate class using X book, we knew roughly the language level of X book, so we had a triangulation. Class, in a range of classrooms, the people that participated in this study worked in secondary schools, universities, and language schools, and they were from 6 different countries: Brazil, Japan, Korea, Mexico, Taiwan, and Turkey. Okay. So here are the participants, and you may say, well, 8 people. That's not very much. How did you get much information out of 8 people? Look at who they were, though. Their main function was not, all of them were classroom teachers, but they also all had a role in teacher training and support, either in their own institution or university, or in working with teachers in other capacities, which brought them into many teachers' classrooms. And so what we were working with is not only their own experience, but their observed experience of other teachers as well. As I said, they were from 6 countries. Interestingly, 6 of the 8 were not mother tongue speakers of English, and that became an interesting point when we looked at some of the points they brought up. And as I said, 6 series were represented in the work that they talked about. So let's look at what we did. We set it up in such a way that we asked first the participants to reflect on and describe how the teachers they observed were using books. And we took them through a series of tasks, which I'll show you in just a minute, which asked them to do this. Then we asked them to respond to questions both from us and from other members of the group, in other words, the other 8, about their accounts. And finally, we asked them to comment on what others reported. This third point was very important because what we found increasingly was when a teacher, for example, from Korea would report an account of a classroom and what was going on in Korea, if we paired that teacher with a teacher from Mexico, we had very interesting data in terms of what was common and uncommon in these 2 settings. And as I said, we were looking for patterns of activity, so we were interested in what emerged as common from all settings. Okay? As I said, the way that we set this up was first to gather these accounts online from these teachers, then to ask them to expand the accounts through a process of question and answer, and finally to compare the accounts by looking at one another's and eliciting common patterns of activity. Okay? Basic time frame is here. It was a 2-month process. There's a lot of time to ask people to be involved. We spent the first week basically getting people comfortable with the online environment. They described the environments in which they worked and got sort of comfortable with working in that way. Then in the next 2 weeks, we focused on the descriptive process. And we gave prompts like describe a basic lesson using the book that you're familiar with. What does it look like? How does the lesson start? How does the lesson end? When you're doing, for example, an oral activity and it breaks down, where does it break down? Because we were focusing on particular books, we were able to really anchor these accounts in particular lessons, which allowed the teachers to compare what they were saying with one another. Then in the middle 2 weeks, 4 and 5, we spent time analyzing those accounts and expanding them through this process of queries. So we would look essentially at the accounts of when people were talking about beginning and how lessons started. And we would compare those and we'd say, you all seem to be saying this. Can you give us more examples of this? Can you give us an example of when this doesn't happen? Can you give us an example when this commonly happens? What are students doing? What are teachers doing? So the expansive process was to flesh out the account. And finally, the last 2 weeks were spent in looking at comparisons, as I said, grouping the teachers multinationally in 3 groups of 3, and having them read each other's accounts, and surface common patterns in them. Okay, let's go ahead to what we found. The general finding, as it almost always seems to be in this kind of work, is probably not new. Basically, in one sense, it doesn't matter what the activities are in the course book as long as two things are true. Students know how to do what the activity requires, and they have access to the language to do it. You say, boy, that was a lot of effort to find out something I could have told you. Well, let's think about that. What does it mean that students know how to do it in terms of what I've said? It means that the disconnects of telling and doing, of task and topic, and of teacher working with students versus teacher directing students, those disconnects have been minimized. How they've been minimized is an interesting point that I want to get to in just a minute. So knowing how doesn't mean that you could ask the student, do you know how to do pair work? And the student says yes. It means that the student has a clear expectation of what pair work is, and that expectation matches the teacher's intention of what pair work is. That's different. Because I could say that I, as a student, know what pair work is because I sit and turn to my friend and we speak in Korean. That's my expectation of what pair work is. As a teacher, my intention is you know pair work is you do what's in the book and you speak in English. So the first point, is really that the students know how to do what the activity requires of them. Meaning that they have a full image.
We're going to be doing a battery change in a moment. Pardon the pause.
Access to enough language to carry it out. And this is a classic problem that surfaced very, very often in what we were looking at, which was that 9 times out of 10 when teachers set up activities, they did so in language that was too complicated for the students to understand. And then they would revert to L1, which created a disconnect in sort of what the activity was, because the version they explained in L1 didn't seem to match what the students thought they heard in L2. And you ended up with sort of this twilight zone of understanding of what was really supposed to be like, what the activity asks for, but also knowing clearly what the structure of the activity is. Okay, let's go ahead. 5 principles came out of this work in this project. The first principle is this notion of well begun is half done. That setting up the activity is key to really getting effective participation. Setting it up well so everyone knows what they're doing. Setting it up well so everyone understands what they're to do and when they will be finished, what constitutes completing the activity. Setting it up well so that everyone understands who they're working with. All of those very basic elements have everything to do with whether an activity runs smoothly or not. Now, again, it's something that we all know from our training, but it is very interesting and indeed instructive how often it doesn't seem to happen many times in classrooms for many good reasons. We're in a hurry, we're moving on, etc., etc. So, setup is key. And one of the things that emerged as a pattern of activities in successful lessons at this level, teachers would show how to do the activity rather than tell students how to do it. They would actually walk through the activity with students once or twice before they would set them free to carry it out. Now, obviously, it was a common activity, you don't have to do that many times, but the showing instead of telling is going to be a key piece of setup. Likewise, when students recognize the regular activity, yeah, we've done this before, that makes setup much easier. Likewise, when things are very clearly laid out, that makes setup easier. Second point, teachers' attention matters. When things fell apart, most of the respondents in this project reported it had to do with the fact that the teacher wasn't circulating and paying attention to what was going on in the class. That she was often at the front of the room, possibly working just with a group of students, possibly not engaged at all. And the students at the back were sort of able to do whatever they wanted to do. Goes back to the word processing story. The more that the teacher circulated and showed attention to what was going on, the more students seemed to be engaged. In the word processing example, the more the teacher mixed the students up so they worked with different peers, the better the knowledge was distributed. There's a parallel, I think, in those 2 points. The third point was an interesting one. Things worked well when it was easy to stop a lesson and pick it up at the next lesson without having to go back. In other words, when in the course book it was easily laid out so that you could stop and start. That things were not so tightly linked that if you stopped here, you'd have to go back and remind everybody to what they did the lesson before. Put another way, as one of our participants said, teaching is in a constant state of being in the present. And you can't really expect people to remember what they did yesterday and the day before. You just want to stay very much focused on what's happening in the present. So this is an interesting point because I think we often set up lessons in such a way that we want them to build, and particularly if we're teaching in an environment where we have short time blocks, we want them to build one on the other. How to do that in such a way that we don't create a lockstep progression is really very key. Fourth point had to do particularly with comprehension-based activities and listening and reading, that it seemed to be key. When they were treated as one-offs, we do this once and we move on, there was little student engagement and little really productive chance of students getting much out of it. When they were structured in such a way that the text was read multiple times, the tape was listened to multiple times, the video was watched a number of times, with different tasks to do with it, comprehension built. Again, something that I think we know, but often because of time or other constraints don't often practice. Final point was this notion of assessment matters. That the more that students could see what they could do and not do, the better off they seemed to be in terms of managing their expectation of lessons. The more that they were able to really monitor where they were with what the task was, the better off they were. So this is not about testing. It's about setting up lessons in such a way that students are able to see progress and able to see what they can and can't do. So these 5 principles, rather, became interesting to us when we looked at the next slide, which is my second to last, design questions. In this case, how can you design course books that actually support participation so that students actually know what they're supposed to do at every moment as they're moving through? And that in a real sense, student and teacher are really on the same page. That it isn't a matter of the teacher having one set of intentions and the students having another set of expectations. Put another way, how can a course book become a locus for participation and a way to organize participation rather than, as you were saying earlier, possibly an inhibitor to it? So let's go to the next slide. Four things really emerged from this process, which takes me back to where I started. It seems to me from this work that we did that in any material, both the topic and the task have to be given, in the sense that you need to have something that's engaging and something that's something to do with it. That focusing in the candy bar example only on the task, absent an interest in doing the task, won't get anywhere. Focusing only on a topic which is engaging with no real meat to do with it won't get anywhere. So that balance, as I said, between topic and task is key. The second thing is that there's language that's accessible to support both what the topic is and how to do it. Put another way, that the instructions are as transparent as the language to do the task. The third point is that things are organized and clearly scaffolded or supported so that people know what they're supposed to do. And the fourth point is that there are opportunities for ongoing assessment. In other words, that in each activity there's a way to look at what I'm learning from it, what I can do now that I couldn't do before. So that takes us back to the basic idea where we started, which is what you do is shaped by where you do it, and that's it. No, it takes us back to the basic idea, and essentially the notion that if we view the textbook, or the coursebook rather, as a place where participation happens, then we can redesign it in such a way that it can, I think, more actively support participation and support this common ground between management and expectation that I was speaking about. So my sense is that the challenge of the next generation of this work is to view course books as tools for participation, because the aim of participation in any setting, whether it's the classroom or anywhere else, is to become competent at what is going on in that setting. And so the degree to which course books match classroom cultures and create the possibility of competence, they become tools for participation. The degree to which they simply organize the knowledge in the classroom and facilitate the acquisition of that knowledge, they're still stuck in a different metaphor of what we mean by teaching and learning. So thank you all. Have a good conference, and I hope there's been something in this that's been